field. And among other work, and that's why we invited him today, he has tried to show how the pragmatist tradition fits into the transcendental tradition, and how pragmatism gets a lot of interest by looking at it transcendentally and looking at it through transcendental lens. And so today we talk to us about Putnam and transcendental manners. And thank you again for being there. It's a great pleasure, and the floor is yours. You have 1 hour of work. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind invitation. I hope you can all hear me now if I speak normally like this. And thank you for coming. And it obviously it would have been great to be there physically in the room with you today, but this was like at a relatively short notice, so it was certainly easier to organize it as an online talk. I'm actually planning to visit Leuven next year, September next year, actually, because there will be the European Philosophy of Religion conference there. So I do have a plan to actually come over there then. So I hope it's okay with you if I share the very simple slides that I prepared. Let's see how this works. Okay, I hope you can see the slides. You can, and then I'll try to switch it to the presentation mode. So now you should see the slides, and you should also see them changing. Okay, so I do have the slides, but I will basically read through a draft of a paper that I've written, which I sent to at least some of you now. I'm not actually sure to whom I sent it, so if you all have it or not, but please feel free to share it among the organizers and the participants. It's not published yet. It's not even peer-reviewed yet. It's just a draft. So please keep that in mind. Please don't quote it or cite it as such. So let me just begin, and then of course I will be very interested in whatever questions and critical comments you might have. So given Hilary Putnam's deep interest in the critical philosophy of Kant, it is slightly surprising that he never sympathized with proposals to compare his views on realism and idealism to Kant's transcendental idealism. In this paper, I'm trying to do what Putnam thought should not be done, read him as a kind of a transcendental philosopher. However, I'm not claiming him to have ever been a transcendental idealist. Given his explicit rejection of transcendental idealism, that would be a bold claim, hardly supported by textual evidence. While I do think that some aspects of Putnam's positions, which of course were in constant flux, as we know, over the decades, can be plausibly re-articulated as pragmatic and naturalized versions of transcendental idealism, I find it safer to here confine myself to an investigation of Putnam's, or rather Putnamian, as I like to say, transcendental arguments. I will argue that some of these arguments offer us useful philosophical resources for developing a pragmatic, non-reductive naturalism. Indeed, a version of transcendental naturalism, or as we might also put it, of pragmatically naturalized transcendental philosophy. This more generally is a topic I've been working on in some of my previous work. Let me note, by way of introduction, that finding transcendental arguments in Putnam should not be any more surprising than finding such arguments controversially in his favorite philosophers like Wittgenstein and William James. In the case of the former, the celebrated private language argument in philosophical investigations has often been analyzed as a transcendental argument, demonstrating that it is a necessary condition for the possibility of linguistic meaning that language is not private. In the case of the latter, James, the discussion we find in Lecture 7 of Pragmatism on what shall we call a thing anyhow, as James puts it, is, in my view, an exercise in something like pragmatist transcendental examination, though of course James himself would never have used such terms, of the necessary, according to James, deeply practice-embedded and purpose-dependent conditions for the possibility of our finding something an object. In a way resembling Putnam's later views, James seems to have maintained that objecthood depends on our purposive practices. There can be no objects for us in the absence of our being able to identify on the basis of our practical needs and interests them as objects of some kind. In an appropriately broad sense of transcendental, these arguments, while not strictly a priori in the Kantian sense, are no less transcendental than Kant's reflections on the necessary conditions for the possibility of objective cognition. It is in this flexible spirit of a broad and open-ended conception of the transcendental that I wish to approach Putnam's philosophy, proposing a transcendental rearticulation of some of his celebrated, though also criticized, arguments. What I'm tentatively suggesting is thus that we may interpret many of Putnam's central arguments as transcendental in a loosely Kantian sense. Despite this interpretive possibility, and despite his obvious Kantian influences, Putnam himself, as I said, never accepted those critics' views who suggested that his internal realism, in particular, could be regarded as a version of Kantian transcendental idealism. And I find his stubbornness somewhat troubling here. I am thus at a meta level proposing that he might have reconsidered his philosophical self-image, more or less as he did so in the case of the realism debate. So on the slide, I have a list of the 5 examples of Putnamian transcendental arguments we will be discussing in a moment, but I will say more about them soon. First, however, I want to say something more general about transcendental arguments and liberal naturalism. When discussing Putnam's status as a transcendental philosopher, we should begin by emphasizing his naturalism. Putnam summarizes, aptly in my view, his view on liberal naturalism by saying that, and I'm quoting, and the quote is there on the screen, the fact that something, perceptual representation or reference or truth or intentionality or reasons, can't be naturalized in the way that physicalists demand doesn't make those things non-natural or queer or suspiciously close to supernatural. Here he obviously sides with John Dewey and the entire tradition of liberal naturalism, citing approvingly Mario de Caro's and David MacArthur's recent works promoting that tradition. In one of his key essays on liberal naturalism, Putnam seeks to show that scientific realism, realistically interpreted truth and reference, and ethical normativity can all be reconciled with naturalism. This is the first chapter of the 2016 book that is actually cited here. Well, I have a list of references at the end, of course. Therefore, Massimo del Utri's comprehensive analysis of Putnam's views in his book last year, emphasizing liberal naturalism as his leading commitment, is not at all far-fetched, I believe, though this emphasis may seem slightly surprising, as Putnam himself never strongly advanced naturalism as his main philosophical stance. As de Lutry summarizes his view, and you can see the quote there, Putnam's naturalism is naturalist because it rejects any supernatural approach to the study of nature, an approach that admits of entities and modes of knowledge that are not compatible with the framework of the natural sciences. And it is liberal because it does not attempt to trace philosophy and the humanities in general back to the successful natural sciences, such as physics. However, Putnam does not ground this view in a transcendental argument, nor do his liberal naturalist interpreters like de Lutry and de Caro. He could have done so, I think. This would have been a natural move within his soft Kantianism, as he himself calls his position, a view that is Kantian in insisting, I'm quoting again, insisting on the mind dependence of all knowledge, but empiricist in rejecting Kant's distinction between the transcendental and the empirical mind and the unrevisable synthetic a priori. Indeed, Putnam's own relatively early account of the revisability and contextuality of the a priori articulates a central background assumption of any reasonable project of naturalizing transcendental arguments. This well-known Putnamian idea is thus not here analyzed as a distinctive transcendental argument in its own right, but something that all of these transcendental arguments can be taken to presuppose. On the other hand, Putnam's reference to Kant's distinction between the transcendental and the empirical mind, in the quote here, is hopelessly inaccurate. Whenever discussing such a Kantian distinction, some context is needed, and here it would be important to point out that this distinction is not, at least not obviously, a metaphysical distinction between two different entities, but a distinction between two ways of considering one's one and only, entirely natural human mind. So, for example, Henry Allison's well-known, though of course also controversial, one-world reading of Kantian transcendental idealism would be relevant here. Now, admittedly, naturalism, even liberal naturalism, and transcendental philosophy might easily seem to be mutually exclusive. However, as the editors of the 2011 volume Transcendental Philosophy and Naturalism, Smith and Sullivan, recognize, transcendental philosophy is unified more by its aims and aspirations than any definite philosophical thesis, and therefore there is no principled reason why naturalism could not take a transcendental shape, provided that it incorporates transcendental arguments or claims. For instance, naturalized transcendental arguments may employ premises adopted from the natural and social sciences. In analyzing Putnam, I want to take my lead from this open-minded announcement. I'm not assuming any unchangeable essence of transcendental arguments other than the loose idea that they investigate philosophically rather than empirically, but not necessarily by presupposing a strongly non-empirical a priori methodology, the necessary conditions for the possibility of something whose actuality we take for granted in our practices. A transcendental naturalist, in my sense, may argue not only that naturalism and transcendental philosophy are compatible, but much more strongly that we can, in the end, only make sense of liberal naturalism by engaging in transcendental argumentation. The relevant arguments here typically focus on the relation between naturalism and normativity. This is a key theme in virtually all naturalism debates, and generally recognized as such. However, while the normativity issue is often approached solely in terms of the reductive versus non-reductive opposition, the debate also needs to invoke the transcendental non-transcendental distinction. What does it mean for us to be committed to a or our normative yet natural form of life from within it, as distinguished from investigating it quasi-empirically from sideways on? How is normativity itself possible as a pervasive feature of our practices? These are the kind of questions that no pragmatist or naturalist can ignore, and it's natural to claim that they require a transcendental analysis. In particular, the transcendental philosopher, even when operating in a pragmatist or naturalist framework, does not find a mere anti-reductionist liberal ontology of normativity sufficient. Norms are not only items of the manifest image in Sellarsian terms, or the common sense world, something that exists or fails to exist out there, depending on whether we construe our world picture in terms of reductive or non-reductive naturalism, and thus something we may liberally take to be real insofar as we are not committed to scientistic reductive naturalism. They are more importantly conditions for the possibility of our having a natural or naturalist or scientific worldview at all. As Putnam notes, science depends on what is not fully scientific at every point. It's in the same 2016 paper I cited earlier. Norms are thus not queer entities, as John Mackey used to claim, that should be metaphysically or scientifically accommodated in the scientific worldview. They are instead what makes any such accommodation possible. This is a way of viewing normativity and its very possibility from within a life always already structured by normativity, not sideways on. A version of this argument defending irreducible normativity, transcendentally reconstructed, may be attributed to Putnam, and I will briefly do so when we get to that stage. I will, however, begin with some even better known Putnamian arguments. So here again are the arguments that I'm going to be discussing. 5 arguments I find in Putnam that I think can rather plausibly be understood as transcendental, though I'm not claiming that they necessarily ought to be interpreted as such. So these are the famous brains in a vat argument, the argument against metaphysical realism based on conceptual relativity, the argument for realism, rejecting, for example, relativism, disquotationalism, other views that Putnam takes to be forms of non-realism. The argument just summarized actually against reductive naturalism or physicalism, as well as the closely related argument for the entanglement of fact and value. I will inevitably have to move on a rather general level when discussing these without analyzing the details, because I'm primarily interested in Putnamian argumentative strategies rather than the success or failure of particular arguments. So first, let us explore the notorious case of brains in a vat. You know the discussion in Reason, Truth, and History, Chapter 1. While Putnam, as we already saw, never accepted the claim that his own views on realism would come even close to Kantian transcendental idealism, he did acknowledge that his own brains in a vat argument, according to which, simplifying dramatically, we cannot possibly be brains in a vat because we could not refer to brains and vats and could thus never meaningfully say or think that we are brains in a vat if we indeed were, is a close relative of a transcendental argument in a fallible and empirically contextualized sense. So this is what he says, and I'm quoting his 1981 book. In spite of the fallibility of my procedure and its dependence upon assumptions which might be described as empirical, for example, the assumption that the mind has no access to external things or properties apart from that provided by the senses, my procedure has a close relation to what Kant called a transcendental investigation. For it is an investigation of the preconditions of reference and hence of thought. Preconditions built into the nature of our minds themselves, though not, as Kant hoped, wholly independent of empirical assumptions. Thus, Putnam did, at least in a qualified sense, and at least in this specific case, accept the possibility of arguing transcendentally. Although, as far as I know, he wrote little explicitly on transcendental arguments, even in relation to this specific case. It should not, therefore, have been impossible for him to view his own argumentation more generally, for example, in favor of something like pragmatic pluralism and against metaphysical realism, soon to be discussed, as transcendental in an analogous sense, because those arguments also address the preconditions of reference and thought. Anyway, the brains in a vat argument, whatever we think of its plausibility, can be taken to be genuinely transcendental insofar as we acknowledge that a transcendental argument can depend on, broadly speaking, empirical premises. In this case, on the externalist idea that the contents of our thought and language use depend on the external world we live in. Note, however, how inaccurately Putnam describes Kant's project in the passage quoted. Certainly there is a sense in which a transcendental investigation of the preconditions of experience and thought usually, or at least in the original Kantian sense, takes place a priori and is thus non-empirical, according to Kant. But there is also an equally clear sense in which even Kant must rely on, broadly speaking, empirical premises. I take it as obvious that Kant, just like Putnam, is committed to, in Putnam's terms, the assumption that the mind has no access to external things or properties apart from that provided by the senses, even though this assumption is, in a wide sense, empirical. In the transcendental aesthetic of the first critique, Kant, after all, rejected the view that we human beings, or finite and rational cognitive agents like us, possess the capacity of intellectual intuition, that is, the capacity of cognizing things in themselves rather than appearances. Our intuition, or unshown, is sensible. The fact that this is so is not itself a fact that could be known independently of a general picture of what we humans, or cognitive agents like us, are like. It was not in vain that Kant suggested that his three critical questions, what can I know, what ought I to do, what may I hope, could all be summarized as the question, what is a human being? So I fail to see why the original Kantian version of of the way in which transcendental argumentation is rooted in what we are like as human beings, or as the kind of finite rational cognitive agents we contingently are, would be any less empirical or any less in need of integrating the a priori with the empirical than Putnam's. I think this is highly significant for an assessment of Putnam's argumentation strategies in relation to what we're calling liberal naturalism. So, secondly, let us consider Putnam's argumentation against metaphysical realism based on conceptual relativity, the label he started to use in the 1980s. My aim is not to advocate his argument for conceptual relativity or his complex views on realism generally, but again to examine the philosophical status of his argumentation in this context. Again, Putnam's defense of conceptual relativity in particular may be seen as a transcendental argument. The basic idea is something like this. Putnam's arguments may be interpreted as seeking to demonstrate that unless we endorse conceptual relativity along the lines briefly explained, for example, in his famous case of a Carnapian world with three individuals, we can make no sense of the idea that the same, so to speak, the same situation or portion of reality may be described in different ways, postulating different objects, as in the case of the Carnapian language and the mereological language used by an imagined Polish logician. However, we do and we have to make sense of this idea, because otherwise we cannot even find our practice of referring to objects intelligible at all. Without conceptual relativity, we end up, or so Putnam seems to be arguing, we end up with the ultimately unintelligible ideas of self-identifying objects and an ontologically pre-structured ready-made world. Putnam famously argues that drawing a dichotomy between what there is in the world as it is in itself, as seen from an absolute God's-eye view on the one hand, and what we project into the world or what is dependent on our cognitive contribution on the other, does not have any clear sense in our cognitive practices. It is equally unintelligible to claim that we can compare our thought and language with reality on sich, as it is to claim that we cannot do so. In order to have a world of objects in the first place, as a world we can think about and refer to, and possibly fallibly cognize, something we may presumably take for granted, that we have such a world available for reference and thought, we must subscribe to conceptual relativity, because the very notion of objecthood can be made sense of only by accepting its, in Putnam's words, extendability. However, conceptual relativity as such does not exhaust the matter. One of the most important moves in Putnam's reflections on his Carnapian world argument and its significance was his response in 2001 to Jennifer Casey's articles on conceptual relativity. Putnam endorses Casey's distinction between optional and non-optional languages and regrets not having made that distinction earlier. While we are free to employ or not employ a language such as mereology, he tells us we're not, given the material and social worlds in which we live, this is a quote, we're not genuinely free not to quantify over tables and chairs. Putnam seems to be saying that the distinction between genuinely optional languages and parts of language that we cannot avoid employing is itself constitutive of our mastering a natural language. He thus seems to argue that being able to distinguish between optional and non-optional cases of language use is a necessary condition for the possibility of meaningful language use. This, perhaps even more clearly than the conceptual relativity argument itself, can be regarded as a transcendental argument, though a pragmatist one, referring to our participation in linguistic practices and its necessary conditions. The upshot appears to be that a metaphysical realist subscribing to a metaphysics of a fixed set of mind and language independent objects and properties out there in a ready-made world, independent of our conceptual and cognitive contribution, cannot make sense of such participation. The metaphysical realist is thus deeply confused, not just mistaken, about the way we relate to the world by means of our language use and thinking and inquiry generally. Metaphysical realism can then perhaps only be transcendentally refuted, just as you arguably have to adopt transcendental idealism in order to argue against transcendental realism in Kant's original formulation of transcendental philosophy. To draw this distinction between transcendental realism and idealism at all in Kant is already to have taken a transcendental turn, and thus to have embraced something like transcendental idealism. For the resolute transcendental realist, or metaphysical realist in Putnam's terms, transcendental idealism is not genuinely available because its intelligibility depends upon assumptions that the transcendental realist would reject at the outset. Of course, Putnam does not and cannot say this in so many words due to his firm resistance to the transcendental vocabulary, but he does repeatedly over the years elaborate on the idea that the entire picture of metaphysical realism is confused or misguided, not simply false. This again supports a transcendental interpretation. The distinction between optional and non-optional languages is significant also because conceptual relativity, as Putnam acknowledges in his reply to Case, is a special instance of the wider phenomenon of pluralism. Here the examples are closer to the real world we're familiar with in both everyday and scientific experience than the Carnapian language versus Mereology example. For instance, the ontological contents of a given situation or state of affairs, such as my office, can be alternatively described by using the scheme of everyday description, speaking of desks and chairs, and by using the scheme of fundamental physics, speaking of fields and particles. Putnam writes, and now I'm afraid I don't have this quotation on the screen, but this is what he says, that we can use both of these schemes without being required to reduce one or both of them to some single fundamental and universal ontology is the doctrine of pluralism. And while conceptual relativity implies pluralism, the reverse is not the case. Pluralism, in an ontologically relevant sense, and perhaps in my terms rather than Putnam's, is a transcendental condition for the possibility of human language use as we know it. We must be able to use these schemes, as he says, without a single absolute reductive ontology in order to be able to engage in the practices we do engage in. That is, for example, to be able to simultaneously live in the world of the ordinary objects in a room and engage in research in theoretical physics, possibly in that very room. Pluralism itself thus functions within what we may call transcendental pragmatism, which analyzes the necessary conditions for the possibility of our engagement in our practices, and thus the necessary conditions for the possibility of something we take as given. A transcendental argument for pragmatic pluralism against metaphysical realism need not and should not simply invoke optional languages and conceptual relativity in the way the Carnapian world argument does. One of Putnam's critics, actually, my old friend and colleague here in Finland, Panu Raatikainen, I don't know if that name is familiar, but he wrote a paper in 2001 in which I think he's right to point out, it's in Dialectica, the journal Dialectica. I think he's right to point out that bringing a highly special conceptual scheme such as Mereology to the picture creates new problems rather than solving any. The Putnamian argument for pluralism more plausibly, I think, starts from non-optional natural languages and our unavoidable commitment to the potential plurality of ontologies that may be formulated within them. As Putnam himself says, we're not free to avoid quantifying over tables and chairs, and it is this non-optionality, instead of optional languages like Mereology, that a genuinely transcendental argument for pluralism should be grounded in, with full awareness of the pragmatic need to also employ highly specialized languages in scientific contexts. What is at issue, even in the case of optional languages, is the availability of some particular ontology, such as Mereology, within which we may speak of the existence of Mereological sums, rather than its actuality, given the use of the relevant language. Different ontological commitments are enabled by our choosing within our practices for whatever pragmatic reasons we may have certain schemes. It is within the use of the relevant scheme that we can then further inquire into the matter and critically discuss the ontological postulations we ought to or ought not to make. In this sense, ontology remains internal to our schemes and practices. Now, metaphysically realist philosophers, or for example, scientific realists rejecting Putnam's internal realism, may at this point remind us that it is one thing to say that we have to use a plurality of languages or schemes, and quite another thing to say that this yields a plurality of acceptable ontologies. However, this is again where Putnam's transcendental philosophy should surface more explicitly than it does. A full-blown Kantian pragmatist or transcendental pragmatist can argue that there is no privileged or fundamental level of metaphysical theorizing apart from our use of the schemes we use or the practices we engage in. By assuming that there is such a level, we also assume that the idea of the totality of all objects or something similar would make sense. And here Putnam's arguments against the intelligibility of such notions strike with their full force. Ontology in Putnam's earlier vocabulary in the internal realism phase is internal to such uses of and engagements with our practice-embedded schemes. When Putnam reaffirmed his stronger realism starting in the 1990s, he might have acknowledged that some version of his internal realism did go too far in the Kantian direction, but even this he was reluctant to admit. Another problem a realist might raise emerges from the fact that Putnam seems to unproblematically help himself to a pre-given ontology of, for example, states of affairs when speaking about the different ways in which the same state of affairs, for example, the three Carnapian individuals or the contents of an office, could be described by using different schemes. Here, however, he explicitly denies that any such ontology of either states of affairs, events, or anything else, that is, any ontology conceived of in terms of metaphysical realism, can be given absolute priority. No one description can be metaphysically privileged. This is the very point of the ideas of conceptual relativity and pluralism, and also a point that was made by pragmatists like James and Dewey more than a century ago. Furthermore, one reason for attributing even something like transcendental idealism, or better, as I like to phrase it, transcendental pragmatism, to Putnam is that he continued even in the 2000s to endorse a certain kind of mind dependence of properties. This is clear, for example, in his 2001 reply to Charles Travis, in which he explicitly notes that he agrees with Travis's view according to which a property, and now I have a couple of short quotes from Putnam, unfortunately they're not on the screen, according to which a property, the sort of thing we describe as a way that objects might conceivably be, requires interpretation, while, I'm quoting again, the reasonableness of property interpretations depends on the human interests and practices that figure in the particular contexts of speaking. Moreover, this mind dependence of properties, as he says, goes all the way down and is deep. I agree with this more or less, and these statements provide, in my view, a useful summary of how a pragmatist might look at the metaphysics of properties. But I also think, perhaps in slight disagreement with Putnam, that a reasonable pragmatist interprets this mind or interpretation dependence transcendentally, again analogously to the way in which empirical reality is taken to be dependent on the human cognitive apparatus in Kant's transcendental idealism, which according to Kant is fully compatible with empirical realism. If interpreted in any other way, mind dependence becomes a highly implausible factual, causal, or empirical claim, and no pragmatist or realist or Kantian or anyone in their right mind should suggest that objects or properties are mind independent in that sense, unless we only speak of humanly created social and cultural reality. Right, so let's move on. Thirdly, Putnam can be said to have engaged in transcendental argumentation, not only in his defense of pragmatic pluralism, but also in reminding us that we cannot just give up our realistic understanding of objective truth as something that cannot be reduced to epistemic concepts such as justifiability under ideal epistemic conditions, as he at one point at the peak of his internal realism himself maintained. Transcendental reflection thus cuts both ways, both in favor of a certain kind of realism and against metaphysical forms of realism that, overlooking pluralism, go too far in that direction. Again, Putnam never explicated the transcendental status of these arguments. In particular, it may be suggested that for a pragmatist and pluralist like Putnam, a transcendental argument is needed to block the possibly threatening Rortian slippery slope into a radically pragmatist conception of truth that in the end gives up the concept of objectivity entirely. If something like this is a correct analysis, then we can draw a simple moral. If you want to be a Putnamian pragmatist and not a Rortian one, you had also, despite Putnam's own doubts, better be a transcendental philosopher. So let us look at this issue a little bit more closely. I'm referring to Putnam's posthumously published the 2022 book cited here. Actually, I already quoted something from that volume just a moment ago. So there is this posthumous volume called Philosophy as Dialogue, which contains his responses to various critics over the years. And I think there are some fresh insights, also in a way creating an implicit dialogue on truth with Rorty, who of course was a long time dialogue partner for Putnam regarding realism, pragmatism, truth, whatever. Now, Rorty saw the realist preoccupation with truth, or truth with a capital T, as he liked to phrase it, as a remnant from the pre-enlightenment and pre-modern view that takes human beings to be answerable to a non- or superhuman force such as God. Astonishingly, the concepts of truth and sin are, for Rorty, intimately related. Reaching full maturity, we just have to give up the idea that we ought to pursue the truth about the way the world is independently of us. More or less as we have given up the idea that to be a good person, we have to get rid of a religiously conceived idea of sin or something like that. Now again, the Putnamian rejoinder at its best takes the form of a transcendental argument, in this case against the Rortian reductive view. We just cannot get rid of the notion of truth. We cannot participate in our practices, especially not the democratic and political ones that Rorty himself finds fundamentally important, without a robust sense of truth, any more than we can participate in them without a robust sense of ontological pluralism, as we just saw Putnam maintain. This does not mean that truth would have to be defined as correspondence with a metaphysically pre-structured reality. Putnam's own arguments against standard forms of realism and for an ontologically relevant pragmatic pluralism have given us good reasons to avoid such metaphysically realist theories of truth. But even if we do subscribe to some form of pragmatism about truth, this does not mean that the objectivity of truth would or coherently could be sacrificed. Moreover, we should remember, of course, that the notorious pragmatist conception of truth, as formulated by James and others, does not simply abandon objectivity or even agreement with reality either, but rather seeks to interpret such agreement pragmatically. While maintaining that all truths we human beings can understand and here Putnam is writing in 2001, again, approximately, although the quotation is from the 22 posthumous book. So while maintaining that all truths we can understand are made true by conditions that are in principle accessible to some human beings at some time or other, Putnam finds it absurd to suppose with anti-realists that, quoting again, there could not be intelligent beings so much smarter than we that some of their thoughts could not even be understood by us, and surely some of those thoughts could be true. This could again be rephrased as a transcendental argument. In order to avoid absurdity in our use of the concept of truth, we must accept the possibility of truths reaching far beyond any human capacities of cognition and understanding. This is necessary for our being able to use the concept of truth in the ways we arguably inescapably have to use it in our linguistic practices. For example, in speaking about the possibility of intelligent beings smarter than us, thinking true thoughts, incomprehensible to us. This, according to Putnam, by no means threatens the view which he around the time of these particular arguments still saw as crucial to his internal realism, that the concepts of truth and warranted assertability are interdependent. However, this would only be to endorse the spirit of Kant's empirical realism, not any full-blown Kantian doctrine, as Putnam explains. And here is a quotation again from the posthumous volume, but written around 2001. But that, and he's referring to this idea of the interdependence of truth and warranted assertability, does not mean that I accept Kant's transcendental claim that space and time are inside us, or the idea that our knowledge fails to reach to the intrinsic properties of the things in themselves, claims whose intelligibility I have repeatedly challenged. Like Peter Strawson, I believe that there is much insight in Kant's critical philosophy, insight that we can inherit and restate, but Kant's transcendental idealism is no part of that insight. I have to say here that it's a minor disappointment that Putnam seems to have taken Strawson's Kant as an at least roughly correct picture of Kant's transcendental idealism. He could have been more open to a transcendental rearticulation of his own views and arguments if he had found his Kant in, for example, Allison's One World reading, instead of Strawson's influential, but according to many later scholars, problematic or even flawed account of Kant. Employing the concept of truth, at any rate, is no more dispensable in our practices than our habit of referring to tables and chairs. We cannot cope, borrowing one of Rorty's favorite terms, without remaining committed to the objectivity of truth in some sense. We may thus even speak of the concept of truth, or more accurately, of our use of that concept as playing a transcendental role in our practices. A sincere commitment to pursuing truth is a necessary condition for the possibility of our genuine participation in not only practices of inquiry, but of thought itself. On the other hand, a fallibilist, pragmatic pluralist must acknowledge the possibility that even our most deeply entrenched transcendental commitments might change in the course of history. It remains an open philosophical issue whether we can even coherently pose the question of whether it would be possible for us to live without a robust concept of truth, and what this would mean. Therefore, the kind of pragmatic transcendental account of truth that I'm attributing to Putnam with qualifications ought to be understood as an incomplete research program rather than any fully developed theory of truth. The challenge is to continue to reflect on the ways in which our life with language, our words and life, quoting one of Putnam's book titles, commits us to a genuine use of the concept of truth. Now, moving on, as I already tentatively suggested when I mean in the early parts of the paper before moving on to considering these 5 transcendental arguments, Putnam's argumentation against reductive naturalism, against physicalism, scientism, or such reductive views, hard naturalism, as some people say, is also transcendental, or can be taken to be transcendental, showing that a commitment to irreducible normativity is necessary for the possibility of having a natural scientific worldview at all. Or so I think we can possibly read him, and I already in the more or less introductory part of the paper suggested something along those lines. The rejection of hard-boiled physicalism can be taken to follow already from the arguments against metaphysical realism, and thus transcendentally, because according to Putnam, physicalism or scientism is one of the prevalent versions, perhaps the only really prevalent version today of metaphysical realism. This is roughly the picture that the way the world is in itself will in the end be described by completed fundamental physics and by such physics alone. The mind and discourse independently existing real things that there are out there in the ready-made world are ultimately scientific objects. So physics and only physics offers us full coverage or an absolute conception of the world. This picture, according to Putnam, makes no sense because science itself, the pursuit of any scientific picture of the world, necessarily presupposes normativity as a characteristic of our practices of pursuing the truth about the world, and there is no way in which this normativity could itself be rendered a mere part of the natural world, thus investigated. Reductive naturalism or physicalism thus has a kind of a blind spot, as we might say, and it may be seen as a task of the kind of transcendental argument that we may find in Putnam to uncover that or show us where the blind spot is. So this brings us to my fifth and final example, Putnam's well-known treatment of the fact-value entanglement. His argumentation against the fact-value dichotomy, an argument very close to the considerations against reductive naturalism or physicalism, indeed so close that it's unclear whether these should even be viewed as distinct arguments, can again be considered transcendental. Presupposing such a dichotomy violates the conditions on the basis of which only we can so much as have facts, any facts, including what we take to be natural facts or facts about the natural world. According to Putnam, we would have no empirical world at all as the object of our descriptions, scientific and non-scientific ones alike, if we did not subscribe to the objectivity of at least some values. Even having a coherent concept of a fact presupposes values, because the ways in which we discuss facts reveals and presupposes our entire holistic system of value commitments. In this sense, values are pervasive and indispensable in our dealings with the world we live in and inquire into. However, as such, they are fully natural in the spirit of liberal naturalism. The fact-value entanglement thus saves naturalism itself from crude reductionism and is an essential element of the defense of non-reductive naturalism. Without going into any details of Putnam's account of the fact-value entanglement, it should be noted that this entanglement, again, in my terms rather than his, is not merely pragmatic, that is pertaining to our practices, but also transcendental, pertaining to the very possibility of our participation in those practices. Values for us are necessarily connected with facts, that is, with any facts we are able to postulate within our practices, and vice versa, given the kind of natural beings we are and the kind of language and concept use we naturally engage in. The Putnamian fact-value entanglement is thus not simply contingent or empirical, that is not a mere factual feature of the natural world we live in, but necessary, though only in a relativized and contextualized sense, more or less like the Wittgensteinian necessity of language being in principle public, not private. So this concludes my catalogue of Putnamian transcendental arguments. I've only been able to explain why I think they can be called transcendental, and while I have expressed some sympathy with them, I have not conclusively defended them or responded to Putnam's critics or anything like that in this brief discussion. Next, what I hope to do before concluding is draw a general philosophical or metaphilosophical moral. I believe the kind of Putnamian arguments that we've briefly investigated should lead us to a reconsideration not only of realism and naturalism, but of the nature of transcendental arguments or transcendental philosophy as well. We may join Henry Ellison in maintaining that transcendental philosophy as such in Kant, and at least arguably more broadly, is necessarily committed to something like some form of transcendental idealism. That is, there is no transcendental argumentation completely disjoined from such idealism. But this idealism itself is reinterpretable via pragmatism as compatible with liberal naturalism. Putnam can offer us crucial help in making this historical and systematic point in dialogue with both the pragmatist tradition and the transcendental tradition. His arguments are helpful in developing a plausible form of pragmatic realism as a critical middle path between metaphysical realism and various anti-realisms. If the transcendental interpretation of this argumentation is on the right track, then what Putnam shows us is not only that pragmatism or pragmatic realism and naturalism is a plausible approach, but that it is the only way to make sense of our both objectively cognizing an independent world, that is empirical realism, and conceptually and categorially structuring that world into a cognizable shape, the pragmatic variant of something like transcendental idealism. Putnamian arguments liberating transcendental philosophy itself from the confines of strict a priorism or metaphysical foundationalism, which Kant, I suppose, never maintained, can thus be used to defend a liberal naturalist account that is liberal toward the transcendental too. This I take to be a highly significant metaphilosophical result of Putnam's engagement with the many philosophical problems that he approaches by means of arguments that we may find transcendentally reinterpretable. In sum, all the 5 arguments considered are arguments about the way we should think of our relation to the world we live in, and thus about our lives as the kind of beings we are. They are then philosophical anthropological arguments, in a sense, though this again is not an expression we usually find in Putnam. The bracing of that argument shows that we cannot view ourselves in terms of global skepticism. The argumentation against metaphysical realism reminds us that we cannot really avoid viewing our relation to the world in terms of a potential multiplicity of conceptual schemes or practices through which we approach what we find real. The argument for realistic truth conversely notes, however, that no such pragmatism or pluralism can coherently give up the idea of truth as some kind of agreement with something that remains, empirically speaking, objectively independent of us, and that truth in this sense must be considered verification transcendent, at least in principle. The arguments against reductive naturalism and in favor of the fact-value entanglement further explicate the nature of our being in the world, so to speak, in terms of our inescapable commitment to normativity, which is itself something natural in the sense of liberal naturalism, seeking to show that for beings like us, there is no factual world out there at all in the absence of values through which we structure the world into relevant objects, properties, and events. Putnam rarely called his view pragmatic naturalism, though he did see himself as some kind of pragmatist and presumably as a kind of liberal naturalist too, as for example Deleutre emphasizes. What he definitely did not subscribe to was a transcendental account of either pragmatism and naturalism, or either pragmatism or naturalism. We may, however, plausibly reinterpret him as a transcendental pragmatic naturalist, grounding his pragmatism and liberal naturalism in, broadly speaking, transcendental considerations referring to the preconditions of thought and language use. His own brains in a vat argument, described as an account of such preconditions by himself, thus provides us with a model of how Putnamian transcendental argumentation generally works, no matter what we think about the success of that relatively early argument. So some final concluding remarks. In Massimo Del Utri's 2024 interpretation of Putnam as a liberal naturalist, he has a full book on that topic. An important recent reading that I have only occasionally referred to in this paper. Putnam emerges as a thinker for whom the human agent point of view, as distinguished from, for example, an imagined absolutely objective point of view of completed science or a metaphysical view from nowhere, is the core of his constantly developing ideas on a range of philosophical issues. It is easy to agree with this interpretation also because it emphasizes the kind of practice-embedded conception of philosophy that we may take to be central to the pragmatist tradition, also discussed in the important collection of essays on the classical pragmatists by Hilary and Ruth Anna Putnam, the 2017 book, Pragmatism as a Way of Life. Del Utri, however, does not explicitly thematize the idea of the transcendental in Putnam, any more than Putnam himself does. What I am suggesting is that the transcendental arguments briefly discussed here offer key Putnamian examples of what it means to adopt the agent perspective in philosophical theorization. They are arguments seeking to show what we must assume in order to be us. That is, in order to be the kind of participants in practices of world conceptualization and world engagement that we take ourselves to be. Who we are and what our thoughts are is something that the liberal transcendental naturalist must endlessly reflect on. Indeed, transcendental argumentation in the Putnamian sense, and more broadly in a pragmatically naturalized sense, can be regarded as a study of what and how we think, what kind of concepts we, as viewed from within our current use of concepts or our conceptual scheme, necessarily use or cannot make intelligible use of, or in other words, what is intelligible and what is intelligible and unintelligible to us. Insofar as we believe with both Kant and the pragmatists that philosophy ought to matter to our life, then we should take transcendental argumentation seriously as a method of clarifying what it is to be the we that has the life and the words it does. So thus conceived, I think this is also an exercise in a meta-level reflection on how exactly philosophy matters. So I think I think that's more or less it. So thank you very much. I spent almost a full hour, and I'm looking forward to any questions you might have.
Many thanks for this brief and very dense talk. I want to know if you would like to have 5 minutes of pause to recover after the talk, so before we move to Q&A, or do you want to move to Q&A right now?
Now, I have to say, I cannot hear very well when you speak.
I will move with my computer when someone is speaking in the room. We're just asking if you want some maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah.
To recover from your talk, right?
Yeah, that would be good. So a 5-minute break and then we start the Q&A.
In 5 minutes.
Okay, good.
Est-ce que j'enregistre les Q&A?
Oui.
Ok. Je mets en pause et... All right. Sorry, I just put the audio.
Yeah. Okay.
So let's begin with the Q&A session. I can begin if you want. I have lots of questions. I guess my first question would be on for you to give us a bit more context on the claim you're defending here. So basically, you're claiming that it is possible to interpret some of the main Putnamian arguments as transcendental arguments, right? But when we hear you, it seems obvious that they are transcendental arguments, because mainly, I guess, of the way you present them. So I guess my first question would be, why is this controversial? Is it controversial to read those arguments as such, or is it not? And maybe another related question would be, why did Putnam resist to call them transcendental? Right.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. Yeah, whether it's controversial or not, I suppose depends on whether we think like Putnam himself did. That, I mean, because he was so resistant to the idea of being interpreted as a transcendental philosopher, or at least as a transcendental idealist of any kind. Because when he started to defend internal realism, which of course was basically his view more or less throughout the 80s, or from the late 70s to the late 80s. Basically, there were some critics, I suppose most of them were actually quite critical of his views, who suggested that, look, this seems to be something like transcendental idealism, right? And he, as far as I recall, he never accepted that. He always tried to explain that this is not really anything like what Kant had in mind when defending transcendental idealism. I suppose one reason why he was so resistant might have been something that briefly came up in the talk, namely his way of finding his Kant from Strawson, because in Strawson's The Bounds of Sense, which was of course a widely read commentary on the critique of pure reason, I mean there is a lot there, of course, and we can't go into any details about Strawson or his way of reading Kant, but certainly he has this idea that transcendental idealism is something that is like an unfortunate metaphysical dimension of what Kant is trying to do, and we should try to take whatever we can from Kant's critical philosophy without endorsing transcendental idealism. So we should somehow find a way of dropping transcendental idealism as some sort of dispensable baggage that we don't really need, and something we're better without, and then keep the rest, or something from the rest at least. So, and of course, as we know, Strawson was one of the key participants in the debates in the 60s, 70s, and so on transcendental arguments. There is this whole discussion. Barry Stroud wrote famous papers and papers criticizing Strawson, and so maybe for some reason Putnam didn't want to have too much to do with that debate, and certainly did not want to have anything to do with transcendental idealism. I really don't remember him commenting on the kind of controversies on Kant and transcendental idealism that then, I mean, emerged from, from Allison's work and so on. So although he was strongly influenced by Kant, and certainly seems to have appreciated Kant very much, he just wanted to maintain some sort of critical distance to, at least, to transcendental idealism. So yeah, I mean, maybe the idea that these arguments can be interpreted as transcendental is not controversial as such. It may only be controversial if we start from Putnam's own view that we should not, or that we should avoid this transcendental vocabulary in general, and always when Putnam himself somehow phrases his ideas in those transcendental terms, when he does say, for example, as I quoted him saying in the Brains in a Vat case, that this is close to or something like Kant's transcendental investigation, he somehow seems to say that a little bit hesitantly, like, look, this may be something like that, but then on the other hand, we have to remember that Kant also made these and these problematic assumptions, and we're not making them, and so on. So yeah, frankly, I'm not sure how well he actually, I mean, he could have offered a more detailed account of what transcendental idealism is in Kant, and then compared his own view to that. I think that's something he could have done, maybe should have done, but of course he did a lot anyway. It's fair that he didn't have to do everything.
Yes, I'm moving. Yes, I am.
Okay. Well, Thanks again for this great talk. Yeah, on comment on what you just saying, the funny thing is that in the if you look at the Plato Stanford article about transcendental arguments, in this, entry of the encyclopedia, the brain is that argument is taken as a paradigmatic example of transcendental arguments. So at least for people who are trying to revive transcendental arguments, brain is that is taken as a paradigmatic example for some reasons. Yeah, just a question of question. Do you know if Putnam ever commented on the Strawson's debate about transcendental arguments?
Well, as far as I know, Putnam was not an active participant in this debate on transcendental arguments in the 60s, for example. He did write those papers on the a priori, for example, and analyticity, and so there are of course those relatively early papers, and in a broad sense, they could be seen as being part of that discussion. But I don't remember. Of course, I never read everything that Putnam wrote. He wrote so much, but I don't want to claim to be any sort of like real specialist on Putnam. I find a lot of Putnam's work like really inspiring and important, and something that needs to be taken very seriously when you're trying to consider these, various issues in pragmatism, transcendental philosophy, and so on. But and of course the realism discussion and all that. But I wouldn't be the best person to tell you whether he ever actually wrote, like in the early work, for instance, something on on transcendental arguments. But I think it is clear that, for example, when we look at some of the reflections on realism and anti-realism, for example, throughout his long engagement with that issue, both during the internal realism phase in the 80s and then later on when he rejected internal realism and started to re-emphasize some sort of ordinary realism or common sense realism, I think throughout those discussions there is this somehow the level of discussion is, we could say it is transcendental in the sense that he's concerned with how and to what extent things make sense, instead of simply asking whether some particular form of realism, for example, is true or false or right or wrong. He is concerned with whether it may be some sort of illusion for us to believe that we could, for example, even have a coherent concept of a ready-made world. It's not just a matter of asking whether somehow contingently or as a matter of fact we can refer to or describe or know an absolutely independent world or not. So that's not the question. The question is whether this makes sense, and if it doesn't, then in what sense exactly it doesn't make sense, or what does it mean for us to say that it doesn't make sense. So in that sense, I think implicitly a lot that we find there in what he's doing when he's writing about realism, for example, is something that does take place at the transcendental level of inquiry, or that is what I would like to suggest.
I agree. Definitely. Take another question, or if someone else has a question.
Questions?
Please do. Okay, I can go on with a more substantial question. To provide the talk, there are so obviously the kind of necessity that is involved in this kind of transcendental argument has to be taken pragmatically, obviously. But in the talk, there are some parts where you are saying stuff like the kind of natural being we are, or that makes sense for us. That seems to be very much against an idea of socio-historical contingents of the practices that we have and that we might practice. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that, and because to my mind, it relates a bit with at some point you were mentioning how you reject Wortian's kind of ideas of about truth. But what seems to me behind this debate seems to be more like a question of some kind of ethical or political idea. But truth rather than like a factual idea about truth. I would say that. It seems to be like more a question about can social change be implemented or not? Because you have this debate inside within the feminist philosophy about objective truth and but does it make sense politically to practice stuff with the idea of objectivity somewhere or not? And it seems to me that the distinction between Putnam and Rorty on these questions about objective truth and about the contingency of within this necessity about how we are and how we do is linked to this kind of political idea about social change, no? I don't know if it makes sense or if I went too far. But...
Okay. Yeah, this.
Maybe I went too far. Maybe sorry.
It's difficult to say anything like quickly or like briefly about such fundamental issues. First of all, I think that the dialogue with Rorty is something that is really important for understanding Putnam and perhaps more generally for understanding the development of pragmatism or the pragmatist tradition in its like neo-pragmatist phase or something like that. I think when it comes to emphasizing our historical contingency and the like radical contingency of all our concepts and ways of thinking, I think Rorty, of course, is the key person there, the key philosopher to take a look at when we want to emphasize that idea of contingency and like draw the conclusions from that and I suppose a reasonable transcendental philosophy such as possibly Putnam's should not simply reject that kind of contingency, but should somehow appreciate that idea of historical and natural contingency, but try to somehow reconcile it with the idea that whenever we try to understand the fundamental ways in which we are looking at the world from within our contingent form of life, or whatever you're using the Wittgensteinian phrase, we can still identify kind of contextual transcendental elements there. So the challenge would then to somehow make this historical and natural contingency and the transcendental dimension somehow compatible with each other or reconcile them with each other. Maybe then one of the main disagreements between Rorty and Putnam over the years or over the decades would be whether or to what extent exactly the notion of truth is needed or what kind of notion of truth, because Rorty of course has a very deflated in his own way disquotational non-robust concept of truth. As we know, of course, truth for Rorty is something that we should not have any philosophical theory about. And even though Putnam, of course, was also opposed to traditional theories like the correspondence theory in some simplified form, he nevertheless seems to have believed that truth is a philosophically substantial concept, and we ought to have some sort of philosophical articulation of that concept, and somehow we should talk about the way in which we need that concept in our practices and so on. Of course, neither Putnam nor Rorty would have resisted, for example, Tarski's semantic definition of truth. That is of course one thing that you can accept a kind of a logical result concerning the concept of truth and the way it operates in our languages. But that is one thing, and then the philosophical significance of all that is another thing, and perhaps it was regarding this philosophical significance itself that Putnam and Rorty were in disagreement, or so it seems. I don't know if this takes any steps to actually answering the question you're posing, but this is what came to my mind like immediate.
Yeah, thank you. You clarify stuff. I'm still kind of like bothered with this idea of contingency and truth, and because yeah, to me it seems very hard to have both to have at the same time the social historical contingency of practice and think so much stuff about the transcendental necessity and contingentize a bit more, but yeah, but I see it's clear, it's very clear how you put it. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe, I mean, regarding contingency and truth, maybe we can, if we consider what Rorty has to say about Orwell's 1984, you may remember the essay on Orwell in Rorty's Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. And there, for example, Rorty offers us this memorable one-liner that if you take care of freedom, then truth can take care of itself. So what matters is that we're free to say what we think is true. What is not as important is what is true or what is false. But what matters is our freedom to say what we think. And I think that is a too straightforward view in the sense that we, at least if we look at the political developments around us today, it's kind of easy to become convinced about the fact that it's also the other way around, that we actually need the concept of truth and a fairly robust concept of truth in order to take care of freedom. If we mean by freedom something else than the kind of flat, mere, reductive, in a way, purely negative freedom of simply being able to say whatever we want to say. I mean, that's the freedom of hate speech and everything, like on social media, and so I think in this particular issue concerning the need for a robust concept of truth, I think in this case, Rorty, for all his, I mean, his many things he says about our historical contingency and so on are really admirable and they need to be taken very seriously. But regarding truth, I think he offers a too strongly deflationary picture, and I think there are better resources in Putnam's version of pragmatism about truth for us to employ, especially when it comes to the contemporary ethical and political situation. I don't know what you think about this, but
I would differ for the same reason, but I don't think it would take us too far into politics, so maybe we should stop there. But thank you very much for clarifying this.
All right. Thank you. I guess, Azat, if you want to ask a question, or it's my turn then. I'll stay in the deep stuff with my next question. I'm having trouble understanding precisely what a pragmatic transcendental argument could. I mean, I've seen how it could look like, but because you gave us 5 examples, 5 quite convincing examples. But I have 2 questions, actually. One is on the factum, as Kant said, the fact that we go from, that we need to explain or that we need to explore the condition for its possibility in a transcendental way. So this fact, according to Kant, is the fact that some of our judgments are a priori and synthetic, that our judgments are objective, universally valid, and necessarily valid. So that's Kant. But Putnam wants those facts to be our practices, right? We go from our practices or some very important features of those practices. And I'm having trouble understanding what it means, this expression, the possibility of our practices. So if you could elaborate a bit more on this very specific point, you see. Because in order to say that for us to be able to engage in such a way with the world and so on, we need to be realists. We need a robust concept of truth and so on. So what it is, this possibility of practice.
Yeah, or perhaps the possibility of genuinely participating in a practice, for example. That you, for example, in order to be able to participate in, for example, practices of political debate and deliberation and something like that, we would need at least some kind of notion of truth. We just can't reduce truth to the deflated Rortian picture. So something like that would be the idea. But I suppose there could be many other philosophical analogues to the idea of having a kind of a pragmatist, or in broad sense pragmatist, transcendental argument or transcendental claim about necessary conditions for the possibility of something. Take, for example, an example that might be relevant to many of Putnam's arguments. Actually, take Thomas Kuhn's theory of science, or scientific revolutions and paradigms and all that. Everybody is familiar with that. And of course, again, Kuhn was not like explicitly a transcendental thinker. He does say something about his relation to Kant, and more or less at the same level as Putnam does, like something relatively brief and a little bit hesitant, like endorsing a kind of a roughly Kantian picture, but I think he actually does say that he's a Kantian with movable categories or something like that. So the kind of transcendental conditions that are needed would themselves be something that is like historically changing and something that can be transformed. So there, the idea would be that if we think about a Kuhnian paradigm, for example, it is like a framework within which it is possible for us to identify scientific objects in a given field within some scientific discipline, something within which it is possible to put forward theories as solutions to problems that could then be evaluated as true or false, depending on how the evidence-based discussion goes. It would be a framework within which it is possible to consider evidence for theories or theoretical hypotheses. And so a kind of a transcendental framework for doing many of the things that we think are highly central to scientific practices, right? So there you would need some kind of transcendental level concepts or ideas to somehow make sense of the possibility of our participation in those scientific practices. Now, of course, I think it would be fine to say that none of this is like forced on us. It is optional to you. The transcendental vocabulary itself is an optional language, in the sense that you don't have to speak about transcendental arguments or transcendental conditions. Yeah, I think you do need some kind of level of inquiry of that kind, something that in a way plays the role or performs the function that is in transcendental philosophy, the function of this kind of reflection on the conditions for the possibility of something. So I think you need something like that. And at the same time, if you consider examples such as the Kuhnian case, then you have some kind of analogous idea of what it could mean to say that we have this like transcendental structure of conditions for the possibility of something, while at the same time acknowledging that this is all in principle historically changing, reinterpretable. Of course, the very idea of Kuhnian paradigms is that they can change, and there can be a new, in a scientific revolution, there can be a new paradigm, or there will be a new paradigm replacing the old one, and then some of the fundamental assumptions of the field, or even all of the fundamental assumptions, will be transformed and replaced by new ones, and so you could say it's a change at the transcendental level, because it concerns the very nature of the discipline, in the sense the kinds of problems that are being formulated and the possibility of certain kinds of objects being identified or referred to, and so on. I don't know if this makes sense, but of course there are many other versions. I mean, you could refer to, Carnap on internal and external questions of existence, right? You could refer to Foucault, like the historical a priori. So you could have very different sources. In the pragmatist tradition, there was, C.I. Lewis wrote on the pragmatic a priori already in the 20s. So relatively early on in the kind of pragmatist tradition, broadly conceived at least, some recognition was made of the idea that you might want to offer some sort of pragmatist version of the transcendental. Although I don't think Lewis talks about the transcendental that much, but he does talk about the a priori, and in a way suggests that it is a pragmatic matter, what we regard as a priori in relation to something that we regard as empirical. So again, it's not that far from, for example, Carnap's distinction between internal and external questions of existence. Which then, of course, I mean, when we get to Quine, of course, Quine is highly significant as a background figure for Putnam, as we all know, and for Rorty for that matter. So these distinctions then, in a way, get criticized in Quine, as we know, and there is no easy way of making the internal external distinction, for example, or the analytic synthetic for that matter, of course. So I don't know. Again, I don't know if this makes sense, but or if you...
Yes. Maybe I'll have a last question, and yeah. So very quick one. It's about not specifically your use of the word transcendental, but generally on the legitimacy to use this adjective with its history to qualify this kind of argument. Because basically what we do when we use those kind of argument is that we say, okay, we have this, and for this to be possible, we need some other conditions, right, to be met. So it's argument that goes from something to its necessary conditions, right? But don't we need something more, an additional ingredient to call it transcendental argument? I don't know what, maybe that it relates to our faculties, or that it is in some sense a priori, even relative a priori, or historical a priori, or does it mean that, I don't know, but I guess my question is just, what's more in transcendental than just necessary condition, right?
Yeah, that I think that is an excellent question. I don't think I have any good answer, but of course, like if the transcendental were merely something that concerns something's being a necessary condition for something else, then that would be perhaps a too broad, too somehow too indeterminate as a conception of the transcendental. Obviously it wouldn't distinguish at all between like transcendental and empirical conditions of that kind. So some notion of the a priori, even if historically relativized, contextualized, is presumably needed, something like that. And maybe another important suggestion, well, you referred to our faculties. Yeah, again, in Kant himself, of course, the transcendental conditions are in a way imposed by our, well, cognitive faculty. As we saw, Putnam talks about Kant's distinction between the transcendental and the empirical mind, as if Kant had maintained that there are like two minds that we have. I don't think that's so accurate as an account of Kant, but certainly the idea that in some sense the transcendental structure of conditions in a way comes from us, and is not available like empirically there in the world that we're trying to cognize. I think that is an important idea, and that would bring us to something like the transcendental subject or the transcendental self, maybe. I didn't really talk about that, but of course it is related to this distinction between the transcendental and the empirical mind. I suppose when we try to somehow characterize the concept of transcendental in a way that is like both broad enough to be like non-essentialist and broad enough to allow for historical variation and different interpretations, but still not too broad in the sense that it identifies a reasonably identifiable transcendental tradition of philosophical reflection. Somehow, I think we should incorporate the idea of transcendental subjectivity there, even if we then do have to again say that this transcendental self, it's certainly not some weird metaphysical immaterial entity like somewhere hidden within us or something like that. Again, in terms of, I mean, I referred loosely, not in any great detail, but I referred to the kind of one world tradition of reading Kant, specifically Allison, but of course there are others, and I don't want to take any stand on how exactly Kant ought to be interpreted, but I think it would be reasonable to use the concept of the transcendental in such a way that we can distinguish between, for example, the transcendental and the empirical mind as some sort of like aspects or perspectives rather than two distinct metaphysical entities. So when it comes to this transcendental subjectivity, that would be something that needs to be added to the general idea of the transcendental being somehow related to the conditions for the possibility, and so then I think this transcendental subjectivity there would have to be understood along these lines, that we would have our, well, natural, historically contingent subjectivity, but we could then in a way take a transcendental perspective on it, and also somehow be able to view that subjectivity as a source of whatever intelligible structure we can find in the world. So in that sense, the transcendental would refer to something that is like, again, in loosely Kantian terms, imposed by us. I don't know if you get the idea that I'm trying to somehow formulate, but basically, I mean, the one of the key ideas would be that something like the subject, something like the transcendental self, or what phenomenologists would call transcendental consciousness, for example, or something like that, would have to be there, would have to be part of the general picture.
Yeah.
Last question from Kevin, and I think we'll wrap this up.
We started late. So.
Yeah, we did.
But we don't want to hold you too long. So. But okay. I don't know. If I hope I didn't misunderstood what you were saying, but at some point you were talking about optional and non-optional language in one of the arguments about Putnam's, right? And I was wondering how language could be optional, more or less optional, and how optional could be a language, because to me, it seems that, for example, took the example of Mereology, but Mereology is non-optional if you want to do Mereology, if you want to practice Mereology, right? So the optionality seems to be tied to the practice you want to enact. In this sense, I wonder how it could, how something could be optional in this way. And related to this question, I don't know if you've ever read Cheng's work on the relativized a priori. He tried to do some stuff in 2008 about contingent transcendental arguments. And in this paper, he was talking about how this kind of transcendental argument makes sense if you choose to produce some practice. And so in this sense, I was wondering if something can be really optional or not, if you're choosing to do, depending on what you choose, and if you're free to choose the practice that you're doing in a way. I suppose it's linked to these kind of ideas, right? If it makes sense.
Yeah. Sorry, you were referring to
Cheng,
you were referring to Hasok Chang, right? No. Yeah. Right. Yeah. When you choose, yeah. Yeah. Certainly, when we're like choosing to engage in a practice and then trying to identify conditions for the possibility of our being able to do so, then in some sense, of course, that is optional if we can choose in the first place. I think when Putnam uses this distinction between optional and non-optional languages, first of all, it is in response to some critical papers that Jennifer Case wrote in the late 90s and early 2000s, where she makes that distinction. And regarding Mereology in particular, the idea would be that you don't really have to do Mereology. It's optional in that sense. You can certainly Mereology is not forced on you. You can say basically everything about the world you want to say without using that particular conceptual scheme. Then if you do use it, then of course certain rules apply. Then you will have to accept the idea that you can like that in addition to individuals, you can also ontologically postulate sums of individuals and so as further individuals. But when Putnam then uses this distinction between the optional and the non-optional, I think he seems to have something like the idea in mind that we find in, well, people like the late Husserl, for example, when it comes to something like life world being a condition, even a transcendental condition for the possibility of science. There would be something non-optional there. Even the scientist would have to like live in the life world of relations between human beings and operating the measurement devices in the laboratory and all that. So this, by the way, of course, would be related to the fact value case. You wouldn't be able to get rid of the normative when you acknowledge this life world dependence of scientific practices. And so it would be in some sense non-optional. So which particular scientific practices you engage in would be an optional matter, I suppose. But then there would be something like at the life world, so to speak, transcendental level, there would be something non-optional there. So as he said in some of the phrases I quoted was, I think, something like you can't avoid quantifying over tables and chairs. You just can't do that. That's not your choice. You live in a world in which there are such things, in which you have to, in order to participate in any practices whatsoever, you will have to somehow acknowledge that you live in a world in which there are tables and chairs. So a language that quantifies over them is not optional in the same sense, at least, as Mereology is. So I mean, maybe the analogy to Husserl, or maybe the analogy to the later Wittgenstein, of course, would be possible here. Again, I don't think Putnam ever accepted or even discussed in any detail the idea of finding transcendental arguments in Wittgenstein. Of course, that is a big discussion actually, and there are many people who suggest that some of the arguments, including the private language argument, of course, but also maybe the discussions in uncertainty, that there is at least a transcendental thread running through those discussions there. Of course, that is controversial because then some others would say there is nothing like that. It's a complete misunderstanding of Wittgenstein to claim him to have had anything to do with the transcendental. So I'm not sure if Putnam had any view on that really. At least he wouldn't. I don't recall him ever really defending the transcendental or the idea of reading Wittgenstein as a transcendental philosopher. Anyway, I mean, these would be the somehow, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if the optional non-optional distinction is as essential as Putnam makes it sound, because also, I mean, if we recognize the kind of full contingency of even transcendental conditions themselves, the kind of historical revisability of basically everything, then we should also treat the distinction between the optional and the non-optional as revisable. Mm-hmm. We might find that something that we thought to be non-optional is actually optional, perhaps vice versa, and so certainly it shouldn't be like a dogmatically assumed distinction. It would be a distinction that would itself be only contextually functional or contextually possible.
Yeah, thanks. I agree absolutely. I think, I mean, even could even go further to say that it's not only historically contingent, but also socially contingent, because the fact that we recognize the table and chairs, because we're in a society where table and chairs are object that matters, but maybe there are some other cultures that don't recognize kind of subject as being pertinent in our ontology or whatever. And if you take like if you're part of if you're PhD students working in a lab with logicists and their language of day-to-day language is mereology, you're not free. It's not optional to do mereology, right? So, I mean, socially you're forced to do mereology. So for you, it's not an optional language; it's an optional language, right? So I actually agree with you that not even historically, but also socially, this distinction is not the dogma, right? There is no universal distinction.
Absolutely, I think when a Kuhnian scientist is trained to be a member of the normal scientific community, is trained to be somebody who operates within a certain paradigm, then of course there's a kind of a social process going on there, and a process of education and so on. Everything is contingent in the sense that things could be otherwise. Another kind of paradigm could be dominant, and after a revolution will be dominant. But still, the kind of social process of including an emerging scientist, for example, in the field, will be such that that person will then not be able to find some things optional, really. That when they learn the paradigm, when they learn to actually live within a certain paradigm and to view the world in terms of that paradigm, because as we know, according to Kuhn, world changes when a paradigm changes. So when they do learn to view the world from the standpoint of a certain paradigm, then there is this non-optionality there. No other paradigm would make sense, really. So, and I think that is the reason why that is a kind of a, well, in some ways at least, a version of the transcendental, a socially in principle, socially conditioned way of or version of the transcendental.
Thanks a lot.
Let's thanks our speaker again.
Thank you for excellent questions. I'm not sure I was able to adequately respond to them or react to them. Of course, these are like issues that need further reflection, and as you know, the paper I presented was only a draft. Really, I hope to make some revisions at some point.
Well, we hope we could have been useful.
Yep.
Thanks again, and the video will be available in YouTube, I think, very shortly.
Okay, great. Will you be able to send me the link when it's available? Great.
Please don't hesitate to share it, naturally.
Okay, wonderful.
Many thanks.
Have a nice end of week, and
We hope
You too. And thank you so much for having me. Thank you again for the kind invitation. I really enjoyed
thank you.
Thanks a lot.
talking and having this discussion. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.